The city's pulse was a cruel lie, a vibrant rhythm that had no room for her. Sophia huddled in a darkened doorway, the concrete a block of ice seeping through her thin coat. At 7 months pregnant, her body was a battlefield, and she was losing. The hunger was a gnawing beast, but it was the silence that terrified her most. The gentle kicks that once reassured her had faded into a worrying stillness, a quiet dread that coiled around her heart. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of a life that had discarded her, a former nursing student whose dreams of healing others had dissolved into a desperate fight to keep her own child alive. Each shiver that racked her frame was not for herself, but a prayer that the tiny life within her could withstand one more night. She remembered warmth. She remembered the weight of a hand in hers, the sound of a voice promising forever. That voice now echoed only in her nightmares, a venomous whisper of betrayal from a man who chose his family's fortune over his own child. Her own family had been no better, their front door slamming shut with the finality of a tomb, their love conditional, their shame more potent than their blood. They had called her a disgrace, a stain on their name, and cast her out into the unforgiving streets. Now, her only family was the silent, fragile being she carried, a child born of a love that had proven to be a mirage. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone, a vessel of life adrift in a sea of indifference. The doctor's words were a constant, frantic drumbeat in her mind. Malnutrition at this stage is a grave risk. The baby needs you to be strong. But strength was a luxury she could no longer afford. She hadn't eaten a real meal in days, and the fear was a physical thing, a tightening in her chest that made it hard to breathe. She would press a trembling hand against her swollen belly, trying to coax a response, a sign that her baby was still fighting, but the silence from within was a terrifying answer. Her desperation was no longer about her own survival, it was the primal, all-consuming terror of a mother watching her child slip away before ever having a chance to breathe the open air. Her own life felt secondary, a mere vessel for a more precious cargo. People flowed around her like a river, their faces illuminated by phone screens and the warm glow of shop windows. They didn't see her. To them, she was part of the urban decay, a shadow to be ignored, a problem for someone else to solve. She saw mothers pulling their children closer, men in expensive suits adjusting their scarves as they passed, their gazes sliding right over her as if she were made of glass. The world was a grand, beautiful party to which she had not been invited. Every laugh she overheard, every scent of food that wafted from a passing car, was a fresh wound, a reminder of the chasm that separated her existence from theirs. She wasn't just hungry, she was invisible, erased by a world too busy to notice a life quietly fading in the cold. Then, a wave of dizziness washed over her, so intense it made the city lights blur into streaks of cruel, mocking color. The hunger was no longer a dull ache, it was a fire, a violent cramping that stole her breath. At that moment, a new fear, sharp and absolute, pierced through her haze. This was it. This was the end. Her body was giving up, and it was taking her child with it. It was this terror, this final, primal roar of a mother refusing to surrender, that pushed her to her feet. Her eyes, wild with a pain that transcended hunger, locked onto the golden light spilling from the grand opening of a luxury restaurant across the street. It was a fortress of warmth and life, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she had to get inside. She stumbled across the street, a ghost drawn to a fire. The restaurant, Aurelia, was more than a building. It was a fortress of light and warmth, a world away from her own. Each step was a negotiation with her failing body, her legs trembling with a weakness that was both hunger and fear. She didn't see the valet parking luxury cars or the velvet rope. She only saw the golden door, a portal to life. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, to accept her fate in the shadows, but the silence from her womb was a louder, more terrifying scream. It was the primal roar of a mother refusing to let her child fade without a fight. This was not a choice. It was an instinct, a final, desperate surge against an indifferent tide. Slipping past a distracted security guard, she was a spectre in their gilded world. The air inside was thick with the scent of roasted herbs and expensive perfume, a combination so overwhelming it almost brought her to her knees. She stood for a moment, a smudge of grey against a canvas of black ties and glittering jewels. The clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of self-satisfied conversation filled the space, a symphony of a life she could only dream of. Her dirty, oversized coat and hollowed-out eyes were an immediate violation of their carefully curated perfection. She was a ghost at the feast, a walking embodiment of the world they paid so much to ignore, and her very presence was an accusation. She took a ragged breath, gathering the last remnants of her strength. Her hand instinctively went to her belly, a silent plea to the child within. Then she opened her mouth, and the sound that escaped was not a request, but a raw, guttural cry that tore through the polite ambience like a blade. "I'm so hungry." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of every sleepless night, every slammed door, every pang of starvation. They were not for them. They were for the tiny, still life she was trying to save. For a frozen second, the entire room fell silent, the clinking glasses and soft laughter ceasing as every eye turned to the source of this raw, unwelcome sound. The illusion of their perfect world had been shattered. The silence was immediately replaced by a wave of whispers, a tide of judgment that washed over her. Gasps of shock turned into murmurs of disgust. They did not see a desperate woman. They saw a disruption, an ugly stain on their evening of excess. A woman in a diamond necklace clutched her pearls, her face a mask of contempt. A man in a tailored suit sneered, shaking his head as if witnessing a cheap, pathetic performance. To them, she was not a person in pain, but an opportunist, a grifter using the most vulgar form of emotional blackmail. Her pregnancy was not a sign of vulnerability, but a calculated prop in her scheme to ruin their night and extort their money. Their judgment was a physical force, pressing down on her, stealing what little air remained in her lungs. They saw her tattered clothes and assumed she was an addict. They saw her wild eyes and deemed her insane. Not one person saw the terrified mother beneath the grime. The staff moved with cold efficiency, their faces trained to show nothing but polite disapproval as they began to converge. The chasm between her world and theirs was no longer just a street. It was a canyon of misunderstanding, carved by wealth and fortified by prejudice. She was a problem to be managed, a piece of trash to be swept out so the party could continue uninterrupted. In their eyes, her desperate cry was an act of aggression. They felt assaulted by her poverty, offended by her pain. How dare she bring her suffering into their sanctuary? She was a trespasser not just on their property, but on their peace of mind. The narrative was written on their faces. She was lazy, she had made poor choices, she was looking for a handout. It was easier to condemn her than to question the world that allowed a pregnant woman to starve, while they feasted on food they wouldn't even finish. Her humanity was invisible to them, erased by the story they chose to believe, a story that kept them comfortable and absolved them of any responsibility. She barely registered their hostile stares. The room was beginning to spin, the glittering lights blurring into painful streaks. The faces were a gallery of contempt, but she wasn't looking at them. Her focus was turned inward, listening for a flutter, a kick, any sign of life from the one person who mattered. She had done it. She had screamed her truth into the void, but the silence that answered from within her was the only judgment she feared. They thought she wanted their money, their pity, but she wanted none of it. She just wanted her baby to live. If this story is touching you, like and share. So many people live through this in silence. 2 security guards, their faces impassive and hard, began to move towards her. They were large men, their movements calm and methodical, as if they were handling a minor inconvenience rather than a human being on the verge of collapse. They were the system's response, the physical manifestation of the room's collective desire to make her disappear. They walked without hurry, confident in their authority, their presence a promise that order would soon be restored. To them, she was not a woman, not a mother-to-be. She was simply a disturbance, and their job was to remove it quietly and efficiently before it could spoil the evening for the people who truly mattered. From a secluded alcove, Alexander Caldwell watched the scene unfold. This event, the launch of his foundation's new charitable wing, was meant to be a monument to his control, a flawless display of power and philanthropy. And now this screaming, filthy woman had torn a hole in his perfect tapestry. His face, usually a mask of detached calm, hardened into something colder. He didn't see a person in pain. He saw a variable he hadn't accounted for, a vulgar disruption to the symphony of wealth he had so carefully composed. She was an error, an ugly piece of data that didn't fit his algorithm of success, and his immediate, instinctual response was not pity, but a quiet, simmering fury. He needed her gone. His mind processed her presence with the ruthless logic he applied to all his business dealings. She was an opportunist, a performer playing the most obvious card in the deck. A pregnant belly and a desperate cry. He had clawed his way out of a world filled with such desperation, and he felt nothing but contempt for what he perceived as weakness. His own past was a locked vault, and her raw need was a pick scraping at the lock. He saw her as a parasite attempting to leech off the success he had bled for. To him, her suffering wasn't real. It was a strategy. This belief was his armor, the shield he used to protect himself from the messy, unpredictable chaos of human vulnerability, a chaos he had vowed long ago to never let touch him again. He did not move towards her. Instead, he gave a nearly invisible signal to his head of security, a subtle dip of his chin that was more potent than any shout. The message was clear. Handle it. Restore order. Erase the stain. He then turned his attention back to the senator he had been speaking with, his posture radiating an unbreachable calm, as if the disruption was a matter as trivial as a spilled drink. This was his power, the ability to make a human being disappear with a gesture, to command the world back into its proper alignment without ever raising his voice. His indifference was a weapon, a declaration that her entire existence was beneath his notice, a piece of dust to be swept away so the polished floor could shine once more. As the two guards began their deliberate, heavy-footed advance, the room's atmosphere shifted. The guests, taking their cue from their host's icy composure, relaxed. Their whispers turned from shock to disdainful amusement. They were safe again, their fortress of privilege secured by their silent king. Sophia was now completely isolated, a lone, fragile figure, about to be swallowed by the system Alexander commanded. The space between the millionaire in his tailored suit and the starving woman in her rags was no longer just a few dozen feet of marble floor. It was a canyon of power, a chasm of experience, and he stood on the side of absolute, unshakable authority, watching her as if she were a specimen under glass. But her cry had been a key. Unlocking a door in his mind he thought was welded shut. "I'm so hungry," the words echoed, not in the grand dining hall, but in the squalid, freezing room of his childhood. He was a boy again, powerless, holding his little sister's hand as her life faded. He could feel the frail bones beneath her skin, could hear her last, faint whisper before she went silent forever. "I'm hungry, Alex." The memory was a physical assault, a ghost's hand clutching his heart, squeezing the air from his lungs. The glittering chandeliers above him blurred, and for a terrifying second, the face of the woman across the room was his sister's, accusing him from across the decades. He fought the memory down, shoving it back into its dark corner with a lifetime of practice. His control was absolute. He strode forward, not towards Sophia, but towards his security chief, his movements clipped and precise. His voice was a low, dangerous whisper, sharp as broken glass. "Give her some cash and get her out of here. Now." The order was a desperate act of self-preservation. It wasn't about her, it was about him. He was trying to pay off a ghost, to throw money at a wound that had never healed, hoping to buy a moment's peace from the voice that her desperation had reawakened. He needed to silence her, because her cry was a mirror to his own deepest failure. The guards obeyed instantly. One of them, a man with a face like stone, pulled a thick roll of bills from his pocket. He approached Sophia not with compassion, but with the weary impatience of someone taking out the trash. The gesture was meant to be a solution, but it was the ultimate act of erasure. It stripped her of her story, her fear, her humanity, reducing her primal maternal terror to a simple transaction. They saw a problem that money could solve. Alexander saw a ghost he needed to banish. No one in that room saw a mother at the end of her rope, a woman whose body was failing as she fought for the life of her unborn child. The chasm between their worlds was absolute. Satisfied the situation was contained, Alexander turned his back on her completely. He was a master of compartmentalization, of moving on. He raised his glass to the senator, a tight, unconvincing smile plastered on his face. The party would continue. The incident would be forgotten. But as he brought the crystal to his lips, he felt a tremor in his hand he could not control. He had ordered her removed from his sight, but he could not remove the echo of her voice from his soul. The collision between their worlds had already occurred. The impact, silent and invisible to all but him, had sent a fracture through the foundation of the fortress he called a life. The security guard approached Sophia with the thick roll of bills held out. An offering meant to silence, not to save, but Sophia didn't see the money. Her gaze, fierce and unwavering, cut through the opulent room and fixed on Alexander's back. This wasn't charity she needed. It was a chance. The crisp banknotes felt like a final coup crushing insult. A transaction designed to erase her and the tiny still life she carried. She wasn't a problem to be paid off. She was a mother at the edge of an abyss. Her refusal was silent, but absolute. She shook her head. A small, almost imperceptible movement, but it was a declaration of war against their casual dismissal. The guard froze, confused, and the whispers in the room shifted from disgust to indignation. Alexander felt her stare like a brand on his skin. He fought the urge to turn, to confront the source of this disruption that now refused to follow the script. Why wouldn't she just take the money and vanish? His mind, a fortress built on logic and control, labeled her a manipulator, an amateur performer escalating her act for a bigger payout. Yet, beneath the cold analysis, a deeper, older part of him stirred. The boy who had watched his sister fade felt a phantom ache. This woman's stubborn pride was a language he had forgotten, a currency his wealth couldn't devalue. He clenched his jaw, furious at his own hesitation, at the unwelcome crack that had appeared in the impenetrable wall around his heart. The head of security, sensing his employer's mounting frustration, stepped forward. His movements were precise, his voice a low, condescending murmur meant only for her. "Ma'am, let's not make this difficult. Take the money and leave quietly. You're disturbing the guests." It was a threat disguised as a courtesy, the velvet glove of the system hiding an iron fist. Her refusal was not pride to him, it was insubordination. He moved a fraction closer, using his size to intimidate, to shrink her world until her only option was compliance. The guests watched with smug approval, their collective judgment reinforcing the narrative. She was the problem, the ungrateful stain on their perfect evening. They were witnessing the restoration of order, and they approved. With a surge of adrenaline born from pure maternal terror, Sophia found her last ounce of strength. She raised a trembling hand and pushed the guard's offering away. The thick roll of cash broke apart, the bills scattering and sliding across the polished marble floor like dead leaves. The sound was a gunshot in the tense silence. "I don't want your money," she rasped, her voice barely audible but carrying the weight of an entire world of pain. She swayed, her energy completely spent, leaving the accusation hanging in the air. The sight of the money on the floor was the final proof for the onlookers. She wasn't just poor, she was unstable. A mad woman who didn't understand the value of their generosity. The scattered currency was a public challenge Alexander could not ignore. It was a mess on his pristine floor, a stain on his authority. He turned, his movements slow and deliberate, his face a mask of controlled fury. For the first time, his eyes locked with hers, and he truly saw her. Not as a woman, but as a flaw in his design, a variable that had spiraled into a humiliating spectacle in front of the city's most powerful people. The sight of his own money, offered and rejected at his feet, was an intimate, public insult. The ghost of his sister was momentarily forgotten, buried under a tidal wave of ice-cold rage at this woman's sheer, incomprehensible audacity to defy him. He strode toward her, the crowd parting before him as if he were a force of nature. He stopped a few feet away, a towering figure of wealth and power looking down at a broken piece of the world he'd fought so hard to escape. "What is it that you want, then?" he asked. His voice was a blade, sharp and dangerously quiet, stripped of all emotion except a chilling contempt. The question was not an offer of help, it was a cross-examination, a demand that she name her price and end this charade. He was reasserting control, trying to force her back into the box he had built for her in his mind, the grifter, the opportunist, and prove to himself that her suffering was just a negotiation. Sophia met his cold gaze and did not flinch. The arrogance in his eyes was a fresh wound, but she held her ground, fueled by a fear that was greater than any man. Her hand, thin and chapped, instinctively cradled her swollen belly, a silent, desperate act of protection. "My baby," she whispered. The words barely escaping her lips meant only for him. "He hasn't moved all day." It wasn't an excuse or a plea for sympathy. It was the simple, terrifying truth, the core of her entire being laid bare. It was an answer so far outside the realm of his transactional world that it hung in the air between them, incomprehensible and yet utterly undeniable. His fortress of logic had no defense against a truth so primal. Before Alexander could process her words, a woman in a silk dress, a prominent socialite whose family had known his for decades, stepped forward. "Alexander, this is ridiculous. Have the police remove her," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "She's clearly unstable and putting on a performance. Don't let her ruin this entire evening." The comment was a spark in a room full of gunpowder, articulating the cold consensus of the crowd and cornering him. It was a reminder of who he was, of the pristine, orderly world he inhabited, a world that had no tolerance for such messy, inconvenient displays of human suffering. He was their king, and they expected him to protect their kingdom from the chaos outside the gates. He was trapped. Sophia's whispered terror about her child echoed in one ear, while the socialite's cold, pragmatic demand for order rang in the other. He looked from Sophia's face, a portrait of raw, unvarnished fear, to the gallery of his peers, their expressions a mixture of impatience and judgment. For a single, shattering moment, the mask of Alexander Caldwell, the magnate, slipped away. The haunted boy who had failed to save his sister stared out from his eyes, caught between the real, visceral pain he had escaped and the sterile, unpowerful world he had built. His security team watched him, their hands ready, waiting for the signal: arrest her or show mercy. The silence in the grand hall became a living thing, thick with tension. Sophia swayed, the last of her strength finally abandoning her as black spots danced in her vision. The guards remained frozen, their actions dictated by the will of the man who stood paralyzed before her. The guests held their breath, waiting for the inevitable resolution that would allow them to return to their wine and their conversations. But the resolution did not come. The battle was no longer in the room. It was inside Alexander. Her desperate, dignified resistance had become a mirror, reflecting a part of his own soul he had tried to bury, and he could not bring himself to look away. The world held its breath, waiting for his command. Alexander stood trapped between two irreconcilable realities: the cold, orderly empire he had built, and the raw, chaotic grief of a past he had sworn to forget. Sophia's words, "He hasn't moved all day," were not a plea but a verdict, a quiet sentence of death that echoed the failure that had haunted his entire life. The expectant faces of his guests, the cold disapproval of the socialite, the impassive readiness of his guards, it was all a stage play, and he had forgotten his lines. He looked at Sophia, at the fierce maternal terror in her eyes, and saw the ghost of a promise he had failed to keep decades ago. His entire fortune felt like a pile of useless stones against the weight of that one silent child. Then her body gave way. It was not a dramatic faint, but a slow, heavy surrender, as if the strings holding her upright had been cut one by one. She crumpled to the marble floor, her fall softened only by the thin fabric of her worn coat. Even as consciousness fled, her hand remained protectively on her belly, a final, instinctual shield against a world that had offered no protection at all. The guests gasped, a collective sound of shock and discomfort. Her collapse was a final, inconvenient truth they could no longer ignore. She was no longer just a disruption. She was a broken human being on the floor of their pristine world, a silent accusation that stained the very air they breathed. The scattered money lay around her like a mocking tribute to their failed solution. As the darkness claimed her, a whisper escaped her lips, so faint it was almost a thought. It was not for the silent, judging room, nor for the man who held her fate in his hands. It was a private, sacred farewell, a mother's final, heartbreaking apology to the life she had fought for. "I'm sorry, little one," she breathed, her voice a thread of sound in the cavernous silence. Mama tried. Alexander, who had taken a step closer to oversee her removal, was the only one near enough to hear it. The words bypassed his ears and struck his soul directly, a key turning in a lock he thought had rusted shut forever. That simple, devastating phrase was a confession of love and failure, a mother's eulogy for a life that had not yet begun. The whisper shattered him. It was not the cry of a grifter or the plea of a beggar. It was the echo of his own deepest wound. He was a boy again, small and powerless, holding his sister's hand as her breathing grew shallow. He had tried. He had stolen bread, begged for scraps, done everything a child could do to fight a battle he was destined to lose. And in the end, it wasn't enough. Sophia's whisper, "Mama tried," was the voice of his own guilt, the validation of a pain he had never allowed himself to feel. In that instant, she ceased to be a stranger. She was the reflection of a tragedy he had spent a lifetime running from, and her pain was a language he understood with every fiber of his being. The glittering ballroom dissolved. The faces of his guests blurred into a meaningless tapestry of wealth and indifference. He was no longer Alexander Caldwell, the magnate. He was Alex, and the boy who had watched his sister die of hunger. He looked at Sophia's unconscious form and saw his sister's fragility, her quiet, desperate fight for one more day. He looked at her swollen belly and saw the innocent life caught in the crossfire, as helpless as he had once been. The carefully constructed walls of his life, built with money and power and emotional distance, crumbled into dust. He was exposed, defenseless against the tidal wave of grief that washed over him, drowning him in the memory of a cold room and a promise he couldn't keep. The icy control that had defined his existence evaporated. A tremor ran through him, a visible crack in his marble facade. The guests, who had been murmuring with impatience, fell silent, stunned by the transformation they were witnessing. The cold, unreadable mask of their host had been replaced by a look of raw, unvarnished agony. His eyes, which had moments before held nothing but contempt, were now wide with a terror that was decades old. He looked from Sophia to his guards, who were still advancing, and the sight of their methodical, impersonal approach felt like a physical blow. They were the system he had created, and it was about to repeat the greatest mistake of his life. "Stop!" The word was torn from his throat, not a command, but a choked, desperate plea. It was a sound no one in that room had ever heard him make. It was raw, human, and utterly broken. The two guards froze in their tracks, their professional composure shattered by the raw emotion in his voice. The entire room was paralyzed, caught in the grip of a drama far more real than any they had ever witnessed. He had, with a single word, shattered the social contract of the evening. He was no longer their host, their leader, their king. He was a man on the edge of an abyss, and he was refusing to let another person fall in. His order was not to protect her from them, but to protect himself from his own ghost. Then he did the unthinkable. Alexander Caldwell, the man who commanded skylines and moved markets, bent his knees. He lowered himself to the cold marble floor, his $1,000 suit creasing in the dust and grime. He ignored the scattered bills that littered the space around her, his own money now meaningless trash. He knelt beside her, a king abdicating his throne to sit in the dirt with the lowest of his subjects. It was an act of surrender, a public dismantling of the power and distance that had been his only refuge. He was closing the chasm between them, not with charity but with a shared humanity, a silent admission that her pain was now his own. He looked down at her face, pale and still, framed by strands of matted hair. The contempt was gone, replaced by a devastating recognition. He saw not an intruder, but a fellow survivor. He saw the warrior spirit that had driven her to this point, the same desperate fire he had once felt as a boy. Her fight was his fight. Her potential loss was his loss, replayed in a new, even more tragic key. The terror on his face was for her child, but it was also for himself, for the boy he had abandoned and the man he had become. In her stillness, he saw a terrifying, unasked-for chance to face the ghost he had been running from his entire life. The silence in the room was now absolute, a sacred space carved out by an act of profound, unexpected empathy. The guests were no longer judges, they were witnesses, their own certainties and prejudices shaken to the core. They watched as the most powerful man they knew knelt in humility before the most vulnerable woman they had ever seen. The system of judgment and dismissal had been broken by a single, whispered apology and a man's decision to finally listen to the echoes of his own heart. The fortress had fallen, and in its ruins, Something new and fragile was beginning to grow. Do you believe in second chances? Comment below, we want to hear from you. Disregarding the sea of stunned, silent faces, Alexander moved with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. The command he gave was not to his security, but to the air itself. A raw order born of old grief. Get Dr. Evans on the line. Now, tell him to meet me at the estate. He didn't wait for a response. In one fluid motion, he slid his arms under Sophia's frail body, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. The act was a public renunciation of his world. He carried her through the parted crowd, his $1,000 suit brushing against her tattered coat, his strength a cradle for her fragility. He left behind the scattered money, the half-eaten feasts, and the gaping mouths of the city's elite, walking out of his own party and into the cold night, carrying not just a woman, but the weight of a second chance he never thought he'd get. Sophia awoke to a profound silence, a quiet so complete it felt like a dream. The scratch of cold pavement was gone, replaced by the impossible softness of high thread-count sheets. A gentle warmth enveloped her, a stark contrast to the bone-deep chill that had been her constant companion. Her first conscious thought was a surge of pure terror, her hand flying to her belly. It was then a calm, steady voice spoke from a chair in the corner. "He's fine." "Your son is fine." A woman in a nurse's uniform smiled gently. "His heartbeat is strong. You're receiving nutrients, and you're both safe now." Sophia's eyes followed the tube in her arm to the IV bag, a clear liquid of life she had only dreamed of. The relief was so overwhelming, so absolute, it felt like a physical blow, and silent tears began to trace paths down her clean cheeks. Later, Alexander stood in the doorway of her room, stripped of his tuxedo and his armor of indifference. He looked smaller, more human, his face etched with a weariness that had nothing to do with the late hour. He didn't enter, respecting the invisible boundary of her new-found sanctuary. "My personal doctor is overseeing your care," he stated, his voice quiet, devoid of its earlier edge. "You and your child will want for nothing. This wing of the house is yours. Stay as long as you need to." He paused, his gaze fixed on a point just past her shoulder, as if the words were difficult to excavate. "What you did back there. No one should have to scream to be seen. No one should have to fight that hard for a life." It wasn't an apology. It was a confession. Sophia watched him, her mind a whirlwind of suspicion and exhaustion. She had learned the hard way that kindness from men like him always came with a price. She searched his eyes for the glint of pity or the shadow of a hidden agenda, but found only a profound, hollowed-out sorrow that seemed ancient. This was not a man offering charity. This was a man paying a debt to a ghost. Her own dignity, the last thing she had left, rose to meet his confession. "I will pay you back," she said, her voice raspy but firm, infused with the strength of a promise. "When my son is born and I can work again, I'll finish my degree. I will repay every cent." Her words hung in the air, transforming his offer from a handout into a loan, an act of mutual respect. Alexander simply nodded, a flicker of profound admiration in his eyes. "I know you will," he said, and with that, he left her in peace. In the days that followed, the quiet of the estate became a healing balm. Sophia ate, she slept, and she read books on neonatal care that Alexander's staff had procured for her. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the large window overlooking a garden, she felt it. Not the faint, panicked flutter of recent weeks, but a strong, definitive kick from within. A powerful, unmistakable declaration of life. She gasped, placing both hands on her belly as another kick followed, then another. A sob of pure, unadulterated joy escaped her. She was not alone. Her son was a fighter, and for the first time in a very long time, she knew, with absolute certainty, that they were both going to survive. 3 years later, the silence that had once terrified Sophia was now a source of peace. Her son, Noah, a vibrant boy with Alexander's quiet intensity in his eyes, chased butterflies in the sun-drenched garden of the Lilly Foundation. Sophia, now a licensed nurse and the Foundation's director of outreach, watched him with a calm that felt like a miracle. She had not only finished her degree, but had become a fierce advocate for women who walked the same desperate path she once had. Her past was no longer a wound. It was a map she used to guide others out of the darkness. She wore her story not as a mark of shame, but as a badge of honor, a testament to the fact that survival could be the seed of a revolution. Alexander was a man remade. The cold, ruthless magnate had been replaced by a quiet philanthropist whose true wealth was measured in the lives he touched. The Lily Foundation, named for the sister he could never save, had become his life's work and his soul's redemption. He no longer hid in his sterile mansion, but spent his days at the foundation, often seen sitting in the playroom, patiently helping a toddler with building blocks or simply listening, truly listening, to a young mother's story. The ghosts of his past had not vanished, but they no longer haunted him. Instead, they walked beside him, their presence a constant, gentle reminder of the power of a single act of compassion to rewrite a life of regret. He found Sophia in the garden, watching her son. The frantic energy that had once surrounded them was gone, replaced by a deep, unspoken understanding. They rarely spoke of that night, for it was woven into the very fabric of their present. "He has your fight," Alexander said softly, his gaze on Noah. Sophia smiled, a genuine, untroubled expression. "He has your strength," she replied, her eyes meeting his. It wasn't a compliment, it was a statement of fact. In helping her rebuild her world, he had dismantled his own fortress, and in its place they had built this sanctuary together, brick by brick, life by life. Their bond transcended gratitude or debt. It was a quiet alliance of two souls who had found their way home. One afternoon, Alexander presented her with a small, heavy object, an old, ornate skeleton key. "This was the key to my sister's hope chest," he explained, his voice thick with emotion. It was the only thing she truly owned. She believed it could unlock any door. He placed it in Sophia's palm. "She would have wanted you to have it." "You unlocked a door for me I thought was sealed forever." Sophia closed her fingers around the cool metal, the weight of it a tangible symbol of their shared journey. It was not a gift of charity, but an exchange of legacies. The legacy of a lost sister and the future of a saved son forever intertwined. It was the key to a future neither of them had dared to imagine. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the garden, Noah ran into his mother's arms. Alexander watched them, a man at peace, his solitude finally broken by the warmth of a chosen family. He was no longer a king in an empty castle, but a guardian, standing at the gates of a place filled with life and second chances. He had learned that true power wasn't in building walls to keep the world out, but in having the courage to tear them down. He had faced his greatest failure, and, in doing so, had discovered his most profound purpose. The pain of the past had not been erased, but it had been transformed into a beacon of hope for countless others who were still lost in the dark. Sophia held her son close, the key warm in her pocket, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against hers. She was no longer the ghost in the doorway, but the keeper of the gate. Her life was a testament to the truth that a person's darkest moment does not have to be their final chapter. Sometimes, the deepest wounds are where the most resilient light gets in. She had not just been given a new life, she had built one, forged in the fires of despair, and tempered by the grace of a stranger who chose to see a human being instead of a problem. Her dignity was not just restored, it was unbreakable. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel and send this video to someone who needs to believe in hope.